Hello, and on the gaming table today, we're taking a look at hidden units and spotting in Command Decision Tested Battle. So this little video will go over the visibility mechanics in Tested Battle, how things are hidden, how things are spotted, when you can engage them, and so on. Visibility and being able to see the enemy is a very important part of this game. Now, basically what we're going to look at here is hidden units and how you can do those on the table, as well as how spotting works in the game. Now, in general, at the start of a game, all units are hidden. That means the enemy can't see what's going on. They don't know exactly where your units are. And units must be spotted or visible to be fired at in the game. Now, hidden units can still be done with models on the table. There's a few different ways you can do this. One way might be to, for example, use decoy models or generic models on the table. So for example, if you've got 10 stands in your command, it might be that you agree with your opponent that you're going to deploy 15 stands and that some of those are basically decoys. The other thing you can do is you can put down models that are more generic. So rather than say putting down a basic Sherman or versus a Sherman Firefly or a Sherman with a 76mm gun, you could put some sort of generic tank model down in the beginning until it's spotted and properly identified by the enemy. So these are some ways you can put some fog of war into the game, even if you don't have, say, a referee who's doing all of the hidden things for you, like on a map or in some other fashion. So lots of different ways you can do this, some recommended in the game, and some you can just figure out as ways that you want to play. In the game, spotting is deterministic, and it's basically based on range and the situation. So the situation gives you the range at which things are spotted. Some of the situations that we might look at is things such as infantry versus vehicles. It's much more difficult for vehicles to spot infantry than vice versa. It's much more difficult for vehicles to spot vehicles, right, than it is for infantry to spot vehicles, just because of the number of eyeballs and maybe the vehicles being buttoned up and so on. Also, there's a big difference if you're moving and firing versus if you're stationary and maybe not firing in terms of how your opponent can see you. If you're in the open versus you're in some sort of concealed terrain, and whether or not you're suppressed or kind of in a heads up position, right? So during the game, units can become suppressed. They button up or go heads down to try and protect themselves. And that's obviously going to affect their spotting distances, their visibility of the enemy. So let's take a look at a couple of little scenarios of this to kind of see how it works. So let's say we've got some stationary infantry in the open and we've got some approaching vehicles, maybe some tanks or half-tracks that are also in the open. Now in this one, we're going to assume that we've got fairly flat open terrain. We're talking kind of the steppes of Russia here, okay? So the infantry can spot the vehicles out to 60 inches in the game, which is 3,000 yards. An inch is 50 yards in the game. Whereas the vehicles will only spot the infantry at 6 inches or 300 yards. Their visibility of the infantry is much more difficult. They can't see them as easily because they're vehicles with fewer eyeballs, they're moving, they may be buttoned down, and so on and so on. Okay? Maybe then the infantry opens fire. Now that they've opened fire, the situation has changed. Now the vehicles can spot the infantry at a much greater distance, up to 30 inches. So as soon as the infantry open fire, the situation changes, and then the spotting range will change. Now let's look at a second situation. If infantry is in concealment, but it's moving, and maybe we've got some tanks in concealment and they're stationary, and maybe they're also unsupported by other infantry. Usually not a good idea. Usually you want your tanks supported by infantry, but let's say these tanks are unsupported. In this case, the infantry could spot the vehicles at a range of 12 inches or 600 yards. They would see them at some reasonable distance. Whereas the vehicles will only spot the infantry at 3 inches or 150 yards. And that's because even though the infantry's moving, they'll be taking advantage of concealment. Again, the vehicles may be buttoned up or things like this. And so basically what the game shows you is that you need infantry for eyes in the game. You can't just rely on your fancy vehicles to do all the work. You can't do much if you can't see things. So infantry is needed for eyes. And this encourages combined arms approaches to be more effective in the game, which is what the combatants found in actual battles in World War II. If you sent in unsupported vehicles, they generally got into trouble against infantry, right? Especially in things like built up terrain or concealing terrain. But when you use combined arms, then everything can be much more effective. So that gives you a little introduction to hidden units and spotting in Command Decision Tested Battle. I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how the game works. When I get some figures on the table soon and some examples, you'll see a little bit more detail. But that's enough for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again real soon.